What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This is episode number 618. My name is Marshall. I'm one of your Limited Resources. And yeah, you know what? Let's just bring him in right now. Joining me all the way from Cornwall in the UK, it is special guest host, Sierkovitz. Sierkovitz, welcome back on the show.
Well, always a pleasure. Unfortunately, for a very good reason, Luis cannot be here today, but all the best for him and, of course, to Gaby.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Luis and Gaby welcomed their new addition to the family into the world just recently. And Santiago, the next world champion in, say 20 years or so, has arrived and everybody's doing well. I talked to Luis today and they're actually back home now, from the hospital and, adjusting to the new routines and everything. And of course, with those adjustments and stuff, Luis is going to take a little bit of time off, from the show, but I've got some exciting guest co-hosts lined up for you. And, our first one is, of course, Sierkovitz here today. We're going to be talking, data. We're going to be talking about, Innistrad Midnight Hunt, and we're going to go deep on a couple of cards and also talk about the broader stroke stuff, in relations to 17 lands and some of the data to kind of continue a conversation that we've been having every time we have, Sierkovitz on. So lot to talk about today on the show. Before we get into it, let's mention our sponsor, channelfireball.com. They are a marketplace now. That means that if you want to buy singles, you head over to Channel Fireball, you punch in the single that you want, and it's actually going to give you an option to buy it from multiple different stores. And these can be big stores, they can be small stores, they can be individual sellers, but it all goes through CFB so that you know it's legit. And that you're going to get your cards. They're going to be in the condition that it said. And that if you, need any, customer service that, Channel Fireball is going to take care of you on that as well. And, this means that at least from a consumer standpoint, they've dramatically increased their stock because now all of a sudden they have, singles from all these different stores are available on them and you can see the prices and the conditions of them, straight away on there. So if you're looking to pick up some singles or of course any of the stuff that you're used to from CFB with the content on the free side or the CFB Pro side or, sealed products or anything like that, you can head over to Channel Fireball and check it out. And, if you do end up picking up something, if you use the code LR at checkout, it lets them know that we sent you over and it helps out the show. We do appreciate it. The show is also brought to you by FTX. That's really it's a fully regulated, safe place to go if you're interested in, getting digital assets like crypto or, NFTs or anything like that. This is a fledgling technology that is just starting to see its first applications. And, when they first came on, I said, well, what do you want us to tell our listeners? And they said, well, all we want to do is be aware. We want them to be aware of us so that if they ever find the need to pick up something along these lines, that we're the place they go. If you're in the US, you go to ftx.us. And if you're outside, you go to ftx.com and you can buy and manage on either the app or the website any of your digital assets that you have. It's an interesting space. It is volatile though. So keep that in mind. I'm not a registered investor or anything like that. And you should definitely consult one before doing really investing of any kind, not just this, but anything. Make sure that you know your stuff before because these things can go up and down, especially in young, technologies like this. And, you want to make sure that you understand what you're getting into before you do. So make sure you do so. But when you're ready, ftx.us for US customers and ftx.com. The show is also brought to you by you via the Patreon. It's patreon.com/limited resources. Like this is a way to support the show directly. This is kind of the bedrock for the show. We're always grateful for our sponsors, but at the end of the day, it's really kind of all about the Patreon for us. And, if you want to support us directly, go to patreon.com/limited resources. You will get a thank you card and a sticker in the mail, regardless of the level that you go. And you'll get access to the Patreon feed, regardless of the level that you're at. And then as you go up, you can get access to cool stuff. Like, for example, you can get an unedited recording of the show. And like me and Sierkovitz, we had a pretty long conversation, just chit-chatting beforehand. You can get access to that, for example. That's patreon.com/limited resources. And I do want to say thanks to everybody who supports us over there. Let's do a Patreon question of the week. This one is actually from me.
Oh.
For
Did you
you,
actually pay for the Patreon?
it doesn't allow me to because I, own it or whatever. So
okay.
I'm
Nice excuse.
Skimming off the company a little here, but I actually, we've talked briefly about it in the past. But I wanted to ask you just a really big picture question that I realize that, probably a lot of our listeners are going, how does this actually work? Which is, how does 17 lands work? Like, where do you guys get the data? Where does it come from?
Okay. I would like to stress that just like you are not the professional financial advisor, I'm not a professional data log cracker from the arena. And, there are people that do it way, way more intensively than I do. And by that, I mean, I don't do anything about it. However, 17 Lands basically scrapes the data from the logs that Arena produces. So if you have an Arena client on your computer, and that's important, on your computer, that's why 17 Lands doesn't work on mobile. Arena creates a log every time you start it, and it records everything you're doing in there. Okay. And it's several people that work with 17 Lands went into those logs and started deciphering them, because very often it's a cryptic information, like cards are coded as numbers. There are some descriptions of what happened in the game that needed to be deciphered. Basically, very often it will be like some new feature is arriving. They ask me, okay, can you play 5 games? Then switch to another account, play another 5 games, then come back to the first account, play another game. And that's how they decipher, for instance, how the username is coded in those logs, because they know exactly what happened and they sort of reverse engineer how does it work. And then they apply it as a general rule to the log cracker. Okay. And the software reads those logs. So important part is that it doesn't get the information as it happens, but maybe with a couple seconds of delay as soon as it's written down in the log, and it collects it as a data file, and then it exports it to the server, and you can see all those replays, and you can see the data from each card, because they collect all the data, and there is a procedure where every game is logged and then calculated into the win rates and everything like that. So that's how it works, basically.
And then you end up with a big bucket of data, and then it's up to you guys over there to kind of start to say, well, how would this be useful? And then to translate that into some type of interface like 17lands.com, for example, that we can go to actually look at the data.
Yeah, exactly. And, it's also there has been some arbitrary decisions on how to calculate win rates, because it's not so straightforward and obvious how to do it. Like, for instance, if you have multiple copies of a card, how do you calculate the win rate of the card if it was drawn in that game? Because we don't know which copy was drawn, really. So there has to be some small arbitrary decisions that later impact the win rates. And, it's good to know that when you analyze the data properly. And basically, at some stage, Robert, the founder of 17 Lands, he made this golden standard on how the data is going to be shown. And then later we had discussions. We added a couple of other metrics to that, and it's been basically adding features as the thing goes along, within the limits. So, for instance, the replay data is pretty hard to parse when you get it, because it's a bunch of numbers. You need to decipher everything, like which card was played on which turn, and obviously they add new mechanics every set, so that needs to be redone from the scratch, because for example, foretell was a big problem, because cards went into foretell zone and you needed to figure out, okay, they were foretold. Or the problem with learn and lessons, because the lesson cards were not in a deck. So we had to add all the sideboard cards all of a sudden, because you had to know if the card was in the sideboard and how did it appear in your hand if it was not in the deck. The software was getting a bit silly for that.
Oh, so, that's funny. Yeah.
Every single expansion, I can see them getting a bit sadder before the release and just come on, let it work. But, so far so good, except for some log issues when they changed completely how the things are logged and you needed to decipher it from scratch. It so far worked quite well, I think, and you still get all the features even after multiple changes into how logs are being recorded.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's great. Yeah. I know that, we're kind of used to it, right? Like in our world now, data collection is just a huge part of the way that we interact. And, the things that we see on our screens and all of that. But, I do think that a lot of people are a little less aware of what actually, like what the mechanics are behind that. So that's why I wanted to bring that up with you. Great answer, by the way. Hey, I actually wonder if I would have asked like a full on programmer, if I would have gotten such a good answer, because they may have gone too, into the weeds, start using acronyms nobody knows.
As an expert in the field, not this field in particular, I do know that you have sometimes the tendency to try to sound smarter than you actually are, rather than to simplify things.
Right.
My golden rule is just like always know your audience. If you talk to the fellow experts, you can go on the jargon. If you talk to people who are vaguely familiar with the field, you probably should try to make it so that I think the most unexperienced person in the building will understand what you mean, and the expert will still get something out of it. That's like a good presentation guideline, I think.
That's really, I, as somebody who has to do a lot of that myself, like, for example, when I'm in the booth for, like we did the World Championship on the weekend, that's a line that I have to think about a lot, right? Because the way that I would talk to you about a game of Limited, for example, isn't the same that I would talk about somebody who's relatively new to Limited or hasn't played the format very much, right? And like, I want to make sure that the commentary I do doesn't make you roll your eyes and go, yes, we know that it's going to be a 40 card deck. Like, come on, dude, right? But at the same time, I got to take care of the people who this is like the first time they've watched Limited. Like, we haven't broadcasted in a long time, and I want to show people how awesome it is, but they can't really figure out how awesome it is unless I tell them what it is, so I definitely hear you there. Also, I have to say, it's kind of interesting hearing you describe how the logs are grabbed and stuff, because this to me is like very intuitive, but I realized why. And it's because before I quit to do Magic stuff, I used to work at AT&T on their website, and my job was to facilitate the scraping of data about customer actions on the front end of the site, and then get that data into a database on like a big scale, and then work with the team, the business side of the team, to take that data and try to make useful metrics that they could use to guide decisions, right? Like a good example would be at that time, we were kind of in the earlier stages of what they call A/B testing, right? Where like there would be two different versions of a page shown to 50% of customers. So like 50% would see, to keep it really simple, let's say they would see a page that had a button on it that was blue, and then the other 50% would see a button on it that was orange. And then we could track, how often they clicked on it or whatever. And then we could look at that data and say, 50.02% of people clicked on orange, and it was, less for blue or whatever. So the website going forward will now have an orange button, right? And they could do these type of refinements, but it even went deeper where we were actually tracking their behaviors, right? So it would be like we could recreate their experience. So they go on the homepage, they log in, they go through some workflow, some checkout flow or whatever, and then they stop and they leave. Why? Right? What page was that on? And so that would be, that's what I was doing for them. And that has a lot of similarity to what you guys do, where it's like you end up with this big bucket of data, but the questions start to come in on, well, what can we do with it? What's useful? How does this let us make better decisions?
I'm pretty sure that the ones that people didn't want to click are still used in something like cancel your account.
Yeah, there you go. See the dark side of optimizing websites. Sierki, let's do a little crack-a-pack here, and I'm gonna kind of lean on you for this one too, because I think people like have a decent idea of where like Luis and I are at with the format, kind of what we would take. And a fresh set of eyes, and you have your own opinions on it. I want to see where you would end up with it. So our first card out, oh, it's a nice one. It's Ecstatic Awakener first away. So already a pretty good start for you.
I already know that I'm going to pick something that I'm actually happy with it from that pack after seeing one card. And that's always a good sign, because I think that Ecstatic Awakener is in the running for the best common in the format. Mm-hmm. I think that if you would evaluate it completely out of context of how the arena drafts are working right now, this would have been probably most likely the pick out of any commons, maybe except for Organ Hoarder, in my opinion. And it's also like it aligns with the game win rate in hand. It's the second common in the set. The only thing against it is that, from my personal experience in best of one queues, black is slightly overdrafted right now. So I would be, if I had like a very similar card in terms of power level in other color, I would probably be tending to pick that one, because I'm just worried that I pick the Ecstatic Awakener and I end up with the mediocre black because it's overdrafted.
Yeah, but and that does happen a lot. Thing. Yeah, I mean, I think that, the combination of Ecstatic Awakener plus the 3 common removal spells in black means that you feel that you have a safe pick when you pick any of those. Also, the fact that the 3 common removal spells are roughly interchangeable. Sure, you might have a preference on which one you like, but normally there's a wide gap, right? Normally there's like one very good one pretty good one, and then one that's a lot worse than those. And that isn't the case here. They all see extensive play in the format. And so, black being overdrafted makes a lot of sense, because those are all commons, and they're all like pretty easy first picks if you don't get something better. Next card is Howl of the Hunt. That's a 2 and a green flash aura that gives your creature +2/+2 in vigilance, and you can untap it if it's a wolf or a werewolf.
Like, I don't feel like scrying so low, so I'm not going to check its win rate, but I assume it's not extremely high.
Your finger got tired scrolling on your mouse.
I think I might. I use the trackpad, so it's like double the effort.
Oh,
so,
yeah, forget that.
I think that the card just missed because, first of all, it wants to play. Okay, I found it. It is pretty low at 51%. That's compared to
for 17 lands. 51% is 40% or something.
It's definitely not there. The Ecstatic Awakener has 61.5. This one has 51.8. That's 10 percentage points difference. And also, for me personally, this card probably feels the best at home in some kind of a werewolf deck, and the werewolf decks are just not good. They just don't work as they should. So
that's pretty
why would I
rough.
want to pick that card ever?
Yeah, I mean it's a bad card that goes into a bad deck.
I think that there is ways of building green-red, which we may talk later about, but it's not the werewolf theme, because it's just not strong enough on common in terms of what it wants to be. Okay. Because if you want to be aggressive, the common werewolves are just not good aggressive cards. And if you want to be mid-range, the common werewolves are just not as good as some other cards in even those colors in terms of being mid-rangey.
Well, I feel like Howl of the Hunt is kind of happy because we just talked about it more than anybody's talked about it in like a month. It's like it got its moment in the sun. Novice Occultist is next. Card's okay.
Well, it's worse than the Awakener, though.
By a lot. It's also best friends with the Awakener.
That is true. But I'd rather have the Awakener and then fill up on the Novice Occultists than to fill up on Novice Occultists and then hope for Awakener to wheel. It does wheel on occasions, which is shocking, but... Yes.
Okay, so definitely the Awakener kind of just takes that spot. Festival Crasher is next. Has a 1 in a red, 1/3, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, he gets +2/+0 until end of turn.
I mean, do agree with Ryan Sachs that this is probably the best red common in the set. I know it's not a universal opinion, but it is a card that gives it a unique spin. And I think that every single color combination of the red spells deck is viable. And there is a large chunk of those decks that have Festival Crasher as their most important card. But I still would pick the Awakener. Just one thing to note, that if you want Festival Crashers, you want multiples of them. You don't want to be happy with one. So if you are feeling a bit adventurous and you want to have a fun draft and you want to force the spells deck, I would just slam the Festival Crasher, but a reasonable pick is still the Awakener.
What about Otherworldly Gaze?
It's a role player in some decks. I actually played it yesterday in the draft. It went 5-3. Thank you very much. But I was trying to build around the Ominous Roost, and it was a sort of filler type of card that I used to A, find my roost, B, get another Void. But really requires a build where you know what you're doing and you have a clear plan that does involve milling yourself a lot and searching for some kind of bombed cards. I think it's more playable in constructed weirdly than in limited.
Yeah. Candlelit Cavalry, that's the 4 and a green 5/5 and can get trample with Coven.
Yeah, I think it's a solid role player. I wouldn't be happy to first pick it ever. There should be a better card than it, but if I win, I'm quite happy to pick it if I'm playing in a deck that can reliably produce Coven.
Yeah, we've already got a couple better cards even in this pack. Search Party Captain's our first white card. That card's pretty good.
I do like that card. It's not personal. I think it's still a good card. It has a relatively decent win rate. It's 58.8% game in hand win rate. Slightly weaker than the Awakener, but again, it's sometimes it's a personal choice. If you feel that you can build a good deck around Search Party Captain, fantastic. And there's nothing better than playing 2 of them on turn 4.
Oh God, yeah, big attack, dump a couple of them on the battlefield. It's great. Celestis Sanctifier, speaking of filler, here this is the 2 and a white 3/2, and when day becomes night or night becomes day, you can look at the top 2 cards of your library and put one of them in your graveyard if you want.
Yeah, I think it's classic definition of filler. However, it's not too bad if you have a white-blue deck that sometimes needs Coven, but that's basic.
Okay. What about Thraben Exorcism? This card just never sees play. It's the 1 and a white instant, exile target spirit, creature with disturb or enchantment.
It's a great sideboard card. So in the best of 1, nothing really.
Yep. Vampire Interloper.
I think that this card is a slight trap, and I think people play it too often, but there are good houses for it. It's just that there are not so many of them. So that card, don't get too excited. It really needs a right home.
Yeah, it's tough because it's an individually powerful card, right? We've seen this in other formats where it's been pretty strong, but it really is narrow in this format. Plus, man, there's just too many cards that come to mind when I look at a Vampire Interloper and go, I don't really want to be there. Particularly the Disturb cards that come back as flyers for cheap, right? There's the blue and the white versions of these.
Baithook Angler is the scourge of this card. And also, there is... So in blue-black decks, you don't want to be super aggressive most of the time. And if you do, you want to do it via zombies and pumping them rather than by attacking with a 2/1. And most of the time, the blue-black decks, they do need something to block. And very often you will end up with this Interloper sadly on the field. And you stare at, and it basically turns into one of more of those DK tokens that can attack multiple times, basically. But the not blocking part is a big punishment. And also there is a thing called Neonate Rush, which is not really optimal with the Interloper.
Very tough. I that's a good comparison, by the way. The Vampire Interloper is like casting a decay token from your hand sometimes. Pretty rough. Uncommons. First one is Field of Ruin. Not so much in the format, but can I interest you in a Morbid Opportunist?
Yes. Yes, you can.
Yeah. So this is better than Awakener, right?
I think so.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So Awakener has very slightly higher numbers in terms of win. Opportunist has a more unique effect, and you're much less likely to get that effect, access to that effect later. And also, if you pick it up very early, you can build around it to maximize that effect. And this card will gain a lot from synergy. So you all of a sudden can value cards like, I don't know, Rotten Reunion, the one that makes 2 zombie decays, the card with flashback, like makes 1, you can flash it back and makes another one and exile something from graveyards.
Yeah.
Now, that card becomes super playable with it because you can, it's also not so bad with the Awakener, but you can play it and you can pick it quite late if you know that you have the Opportunist and you know that you can rely on that effect. While if you just pass it and pick the Awakener, you might never see another Opportunist, and I almost guarantee you're going to see the second Awakener in the draft.
Yeah, so there you go. Morbid Opportunist is the headliner currently. Mystic Skull is next. Not so much.
Not for me, no. I think it may be okay in sealed, but not in draft.
Okay. And then our rare is Siphon Insight. That's the blue-black instant. Look at the top 2 cards of the opponent's library, and you can exile 1 and play it anytime, and you can flash it back for 1 blue-black.
Yeah, the drink twice, I think it's called.
Oh, God, that's pretty good.
So I mean, the card is okay. I think that this is another card that has this weird appeal to Magic players in general, that you want to win with the opponent's cards, but numbers are, I don't think that they're particularly great on that card. So the game in hand win rate is 52%. For blue-black, that's just not good enough.
Right.
I think that it's another card that will be much better in constructed, where you can actually guarantee that the opponents are playing something good in their deck.
Right. So you're on Opportunist here?
I'm still on the Opportunist and then closely Awakener, but I think that with some different preferences, you can pick from Search Party Captain, Festival Crasher.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I'm definitely on the Opportunist. I keep it simple, Sierkovitz. I don't mess around.
Because it's your preference, Marshall. That's your preference. You like grindy decks that draw cards.
Oh, God, I sure do. I feel like I win more with them. I feel more comfortable playing them. I feel like they're good. Like, definitely.
But, I always found it a trap to just blindly follow the best archetypes when you clearly don't know how to. You clearly don't fit some play style with you. I think that you should have a strong preference for decks that suit your playstyle. I play aggro more and I play tempo more because I think it plays me better than control archetypes. Because I'm just getting lost in longer games. I just get tired, impatient. I'm not having like this spider in the middle of the net mentality that I can sit and wait for.
Wow, that's a really good way to put that. I like that. Wait for your prey to come climbing by and then grab it. You want to go out there and go hunting.
I'm more proactive in that. I was raised in the Suicide Black era of Magic when you won quick and you won on 4 life, but or you lost very quick and you lost on 0 life, obviously.
Yeah, maybe even less. Okay, well, let's get into some discussions here, because you've been doing some cool stuff around, again, the data from 17 lands and kind of how those things have been interpreted and stuff. And one of the things you did recently was taking a deeper look at the sub builds within an archetype, right? Like there's usually a headline build for these archetypes. You go like blue, black. Oh, it's zombies. But sometimes the limited set actually gives us enough overlap to kind of have a build that's similar to the main one, but it has significant differences and values different cards higher. What have you been doing with that?
Okay, so maybe to start with, I think that you use the word sometimes a bit liberally. I think that there's always sub-builds in every archetype, and I think that content creation in general, and I know for very good reasons, because you need to communicate big ideas, and there is never time to like go really deep into everything. But very often, content creation conflates color pair as one thing. But I do strongly think that every single archetype has at least several slightly different builds. And, they can be drastically different. Like werewolves green-red in Midnight Hunt and spells green-red are completely 2 different animals. There's like probably very little overlap between
See, that
those.
to me is a legit sub-build. But when you're talking about the others, I'm thinking more like in terms of, it's like a spectrum, but the spectrum isn't that the deck changes. It's that it's less or more good at the thing that it was trying to do. Like
it's maybe different plans. But so what I do with this analysis is I take thousands of decks from a particular single archetype, color pair, and I convert them to numbers, and then I plot them on a 2-dimensional space. So basically you have like a bunch of dots. They look like a massive blob. And of course, this is very uninformative because I just see a massive blob of dots. So what I do then is I look at the win rates of each of those decks. So each dot will have an assigned win rate. And to make it a bit more consistent, because of course, there is variance, you got lucky a couple of times, you go 7-1. You got unlucky a couple of times, you go 0-3. Even though the deck can be very similar. So what I do is I take a look at the nearest neighbors of the particular blob and calculate the average win rate for the dot and its 20 nearest neighbors. Because I plotted them on this 2-dimensional space, I know which decks are the closest, and how I plot them is based on their composition. So I know that the closest decks are also having the most similar composition in terms of which cards are inside. Okay. So basically, then I have the win rate of the neighbors and the deck. I can look for hotspots of winning. So there will be areas on that blob where there is decks that win quite a lot, and there will be areas when the decks lose quite a lot. And then what I can do is I can look at the composition of the decks that win a lot and the composition of the decks that lose a lot. But there is an additional extra value for that. I can identify clusters of dots that are close to each other, have a high win rate, and are separate from the main blob of the typical build. And I can find those maybe a bit more niche versions of the archetype
that are actually winning.
That are actually winning, yeah. And also, I mean, this is something I didn't focus on, but I can also find which combinations are losing and what's wrong with them. Like, do they have too much of a top end, or do they try to be too aggressive in the color pair that does not support aggressive archetypes?
Right. And I saw when you presented this, you're able to kind of like, you can basically highlight those dots so that like when I look at it on the screen, you can say this grouping over here represents this and this grouping over here, so that you can actually kind of break it down in a visual way for us that actually separates those things out.
Yes, exactly. That's just for the visualization. And then I look at the composition and I say, this grouping of dots is winning, but it's not your average zombie build, because these decks on average, I looked at 50 of them. On average, they had 3 zombies in the deck and maybe 2 spells that made decayed creatures. So that was clearly not focusing on zombies. But these decks on average have 8 removal spells, while your average zombie build has 2, 3. So clearly this was an attrition build based sub-archetype. This is based on actual data. So now I'm talking a bit about one build that I found quite interesting. There was this blue-black attrition that had a lot of removal. And all of a sudden in that deck, the 2/3 Menace Werewolf was a good card.
The shadowy traveler?
Exactly, because first of all, you have a lot of removal, which makes Menace quite difficult to deal with, because you need to have 2 creatures alive on the board to block it. But also because most of the removal is instant, it was very easy for you to trigger day and night cycle, because you just don't play anything on your turn, switch it, Olivia Midnight Ambush, they're one of their blockers, and you have a 4/4 Menace. They can play 2 spells, of course, but not always. So in the end, if you play this long attrition game, you could actually win. Now, I don't think that this is a very easy archetype to build, but it's one of the possibilities. And, also looking at those clusters, I could find that there is a Flyers build within the blue-black that had way more flying creatures. And then it could, for example, utilize Locked in the Cemetery, because this card is normally not so good. But if you kill them with Flyers, tapping one of their attacking creatures and racing like this, it was not such a bad idea. And actually, those decks seem to be using this card, even though this card, I wouldn't recommend you playing it in your average blue-black build.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. What was the, I'm going to put a link in the show notes so that people can check this out, but can you just describe like where and how you're showing this stuff?
Oh, yeah. So I'm trying to do my weekly seminars. It's basically on Twitch, on my twitch.tv/Sierkovitz. Once a week, I try to look at some piece of 17 Lands data and talk about the topic, random topic. It can be like very set specific, like those archetype analyses were definitely very archetype specific. But sometimes I talk about resource use. So what advantage do you get from spending 1 more mana than your opponent during a game, and how can you utilize it?
God. Or I love stuff like that. I really love stuff like that. Yeah.
This week I'm going to be talking about speed of the format and the play advantage. So we talk a bit about, it's good to be on the play. And I plotted some things like the duration of the game and the winning, on which turn do you win. And basically from that plot, you can visualize what does it truly mean to be on the play. And basically what was the previous set? It was so long ago already.
AFR.
In AFR, the being on the play advantage materialized on turns 5, 6, and 7. That's basically the 3 turns where you win way more often than you should based on the distribution of the win rates when you're on the play. So these are the 3 turns when you get the advantage. So basically, if you don't win by those 3 turns, this whole advantage of being on the play slowly disappears. And by turn 8, 9, you actually are disadvantaged because you didn't win by that time, which means that now opponent has 1 more card in their deck you didn't materialize your advantage.
I
So
see.
I'm going to look at those kind of numbers and try to compare how they changed over the sets and which sets were different, and maybe which artifacts are better in utilizing the advantage and which rely on being on the play just because if they are not, they're going to lose to fast decks, basically.
Right. You said that you stream this on your Twitch, on your stream, but do you put these up on YouTube, or can people find the VODs of them? I mean, people are going to want to go back and see these.
Oh yes, the VODs are still there, and I'm slowly, because I'm a very bad person in this kind of thing, I'm slowly putting them on YouTube, which is also Sierkovitz. I try to have a single brand.
Good. Okay. Yeah. I'll put links to both of these in the show notes as well, to your YouTube page and to your stream, so that people can find them. But yeah, come on, man. We need to make sure these are out there. Like, these are really interesting things that you do.
I try to put the general ones faster on YouTube because I think that they are more useful. They are all saved on the hard drives, and I just need to edit video, and I don't have JAF.
Yeah, totally. we might need to talk about that. Yeah, because this stuff's just too cool to have stored up on your hard drive. We need to get it out into the world. I mean, broad stroke stuff is great, but even the nerdy, maybe it doesn't help you actually win a draft, but it's like it helps you understand how cards work, how concepts work, how things go. Like, you can. I'm a big fan of going really deep on a kind of obscure topic every once in a while too, right? Just to kind of expand your brain and to teach you how to learn and how to understand that type of stuff. So super cool. Yeah. When are you doing the play draw one?
I think I was supposed to do it today.
Oh,
but
no.
Something popped out.
Did you have something else to do?
No, I mean, I gave up that idea a long time ago when you told me that you would want to have me on, limited resources always come first.
Oh, I like that. Our listeners appreciate it too.
Obviously. Otherwise, they wouldn't be your listeners, I think.
No, I'm saying they appreciate you prioritizing them. It's very kind.
Well, they are, limited is always on the fringe of Magic, even though it's clearly the best format. So everyone who agrees with that should be prioritized. And since you have quite a large fan base,
yes.
I mean, how could you say no to that?
Yeah, our people,
Exactly. I will put it up on Sunday. I think okay. 2 Pacific, 5 Eastern, something like that.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's something to look forward to on the weekend. Another thing I wanted to talk to you about. Are we good on the archetype sub builds? Did you have anything else you wanted to add to that?
So, I mean, just that. I only started developing this tool. So I did the blue-black as a sort of first try. And I think that was actually a mistake because blue-black has such an obvious good build that maybe I should have gone for something more wild in terms of how to do it. Mm-hmm. So the week after that, I did it not as an archetype sub-build analysis, but I focused on individual cards. So I took some cards that I thought were interesting, and I looked at decks that contained this card, and I looked at what builds containing those cards are the most interesting ones and the ones that can actually win. And one of those cards was Seize the Storm. So that was my other episode, just looking at how to make Seize the Storm tick. Because, and here comes the data part of it, now it changed. It's the second to last picked red uncommon. It was the lowest picked red uncommon. And I think that doesn't do any service to this card. This card is phenomenal if used properly. And I got angry about people not loving the cards that clearly is my pet card, and I made an immense amount of builds using it. And I just decided, okay, let's look what makes it tick. And there again, I could find like at least 6 different color combinations. Because the point is, when I look at blue-black, I only have one massive blob because all blue-black decks are going to be slightly similar. Mm-hmm. If I take a card that goes into multiple archetypes and I look at the multiple archetypes, I will get multiple blobs because there's at least 4 archetypes that it will go to naturally. And Seize the Storm also was quite good in Simic as a splash. So I got actually 5 different islands. And
which we saw at Worlds, by the way, right?
Yes, we did. We did twice.
You must have been so happy.
I was, I was watching the coverage, of course, in the VOD because, FNM comes first before the Worlds. It's with real people I know. Yeah. But I came back from the FNM and I watched the VOD, and I saw Paolo opening Seize the Storm, and of course he speculated about picking it, but chickened out. I wouldn't. I would just slam it. But maybe that's why he is there and I am here. And then when I saw the pack one, pick 7, second Seize the Storm, I was like, oh. And I think that if he stuck to the guns and he would have picked, he had a couple of play with fires, which are amazing in this type of deck in the first pack. There was a Moonrager Slash to be picked. There was the Neonate Rashes. I think that he had a chance of having 4 Seize the Storms and a lot of spells deck because he actually saw 4 of them.
That's incredible.
You can't know it. It was just insane that he saw 4 of them.
Yeah, because you never see, especially with how many of the uncommons. There's 70 in the set or whatever?
It's 0.9 per pod.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Wow. So of any given uncommon, the average is less than 1 per pod.
Yep.
And they open 4 of the same one. So very unlikely.
These are actually good numbers to remember. It's around 2.4 commons per pod and 0.9 uncommons per pod in the normal set.
Okay.
That's like good to know, like on average. So
yeah, I remember a few years ago they started printing more uncommons. There was just a greater number of them. It went up. I think it went from 40 something to 70 or 70 something or something like that. Because it affected us because it changed the set reviews because they're just longer. They just added a bunch of cards, to do, but it also is meaningful for particularly synergistic decks, right? Like decks that need multiples of certain things. Like if it's an uncommon, you're well, as you just said, extremely unlikely to get even more than 1.
But yeah, exactly. That's why during what's the pick, I was higher on the Morbid Opportunist because I know that the chance of seeing another one is very low.
Yeah. Okay. Huh. Yeah, but we did end up with a teamer deck that had the what's it called, Seize the Storm in it.
Yeah, there were 2 of them. They didn't do very well.
Right.
I didn't analyze their builds, but yeah, I think that the key card for those decks is Shadow Beast Sighting.
Yes.
Because it's a creature, a decent creature actually. But if you add that it also synergizes with your Seize later, that becomes a great creature. So yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that, without going into too much detail about those Seize the Storm deck builds, but there is definitely, like within the blue-red, which was the biggest cluster, there were 2 completely contrasting builds of it. Like there was one group of builds that had on average something like 2 Festival Crushers, and that was clearly the aggro version of it that has cheap spells, Crushers, and then Seize the Storm as your sort of, okay, I ran out of the steam with Crushers, I'm going to play a 7/7 and kill you. Mm-hmm. And there was the much slower version, like very controlling, and that was not doing much in the beginning because it didn't have Crushers. But then it was just playing a slow attrition game and then plop, plop, put a couple of 7/7s that grow with every spell that you play and finish with the job with this. And it was seen like across the archetypes. I think I played a very good black-red Seize the Storm deck where it's just basically Festival Crushers, the 1 mana, 1/1 first strike vampires, because they're great if you don't want to play too much in your turn. They become 5/1 first strikers, really annoying to deal with. I think I had 3 of them, 4 Crushers, 2 Florians, the rare vampires.
Oh, okay.
Pretty decent in this. And then the rest was just removal and burn and then Seize the Storm as a top end. And it can also work like this. And yeah, while the green-red Seize the Storm decks, classic mid-range, they don't want to kill early, they want to survive early. And then they just play Shadow Beast Sighting, Rise of the Ants, Seize the Storm, and it all fuels each other, and it is lovely once it works.
Did you see that deck show up in strongly as a sub archetype? Because that is a deck that has gotten quite a bit of chatter. You don't see it that often. Like when you're playing, it's not like, oh yeah, they have the red green spells deck, but people do talk about it. Was that a thing that stood out to you?
I have to say that the Groove version was the least successful of all the builds of Seize the Storm decks. And I think that within the data set that I analyzed, a good chunk of the decks were mine.
Oh, that's absolutely incredible.
Because, I can look at the composition. Of course, I cannot know which user's deck it is because we don't have that. That data is staying on the server. We work blindly. We cannot identify a player from the deck lists. I mean, you could if you just go on Twitter of someone and check their decks and then figure out blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But we don't have the player identifier in the data. We just have the player win rate, and all the players with the same win rate are clustered together.
Okay.
So that, to protect the privacy of the users. And we don't need that. We don't need to trace someone individually to each particular deck, especially in the data sets that are shared publicly. You don't want that kind of stuff. But I know what I drafted, so I can look at the composition and say, yep, that's one of mine.
Oh, that's amazing that showed up. I didn't even think about that.
Well, sometimes awesome. You have to analyze yourself. That was an introspective for me.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
But you can build them. And I think that, mine were decent because I had a good idea of what I want to build with them. And at that particular time, I think that the time is gone now, unfortunately. Red was so open and green was a bit underdrafted, and you can just basically do it a la carte. You can just draft them every single time.
There was a pretty long stretch that was like that, for sure. One thing that you and I had talked about before and that I wanted to hit up on this episode was kind of a little, I don't know, an experiment that you did that I think that you've done before that I think is really an interesting way to look at an archetype, particularly early in a format when, like, we have signposts on commons. We've read the set. Maybe, our listeners have listened to the set review or whatever. So they're like, say 6 or 7 of the archetypes are kind of like, okay, I have an idea, like blue-red is spells. I don't really know what that means yet, but that's what they were going for, right? And then, like, okay, that one's werewolves and this one's +1/+1 counters and that one's life gain. But then there's always like 2 or 3 that are kind of like, blue-green something. Like, I guess you can make mana and get some cards, but it's not like quite as dialed in. There's not literally cards that say, if you control other of this creature type, then your deck is going to be good, So it's a little bit less clear. You call them skeletons, I think, right? Where you, to kind of explore this space without having drafted 50 drafts yet.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is something that I do with a couple of like-minded limited players. We usually do it instead of set review. We build a version of each color combination based on a formula. So basically, it's before the set is being released. Usually like a couple of days before the release, we sit down, we build our skeletons, and then we discuss why we put a card like this in the skeleton. But it's based 100% on theory crafting rather than on playing. So we don't play, we just theory craft and look what's going on.
Okay, so what is a skeleton? How do you define that?
A skeleton, I know that some people build skeletons differently. I know that Sam Black is a big fan of building skeletons before the format starts. Mm-hmm. But so based on how limited Magic worked for the last several years, it's very uncommon centric, I would say. Like, when you look at the decks, the uncommons are the driving force behind how good the decks are. And, that might be linked to the fact that they increase the number of uncommons so they can print slightly more powerful ones, because you won't have 3 of them every draft and it won't ruin the format. While if you have maybe only 40 uncommons in the set, you will get 2-3 of them every single draft and it will just ruin the game pleasure, because Mythic Uncommon will then literally be as frequent as a common per pod. So it's based on building a 40-card deck that has 1 rare, only 1 rare, no more than that. Be very careful about what you pick. 6 uncommons, and they all have to be one-offs.
Okay.
And then you fill the rest with commons, but you also are limited not to put like 7 copies of something because you feel that it's going to be good. You want to keep it realistic, so we usually cut off at you can duplicate 6 of your commons, and that's it.
Okay, and then that's for you is the skeleton of an archetype.
That's the skeleton. It's a valid deck. It's just that's based on certain rules. You build it, and then you think, okay, will it be good or will it not be good? And the good part of it is that you are getting very quickly going to get evaluation of how good it was. So I have to say, like this season, I nailed the blue-black because I had.
You did.
I think that I built like a 7-1, 7 something deck out of my skeleton. But some colors, God, it would be very, very bad to play with something like that. Like, definitely there were misses in history, and there were some minor successes as well.
So are you trying to build the best possible version given the restrictions? Is that what your goal is?
I try to build a deck that I think will work, but I also sometimes limit myself depending on if I understand the archetype just by looking at the cards. Sometimes it happens that I look at the set and I say, okay, I think I get Wizards want me to do this, and I think that this is actually going to be successful. I'm going to build it like this. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I'm building a skeleton like, okay, Wizards wants me to do this. I don't know if that can work, but if it would, then I build it like this. And sometimes I see that Wizards wants me to do something, but that's clearly not going to work. I need to build this skeleton differently. And then, based on this different build, I'm going to be successful. And it happens very rarely that before the season is released, you can actually come up with the alternative build instantly. Like, red-green spells would be a good example. Or the green-blue wizards from Zendikar Rising was another archetype that was not what you were supposed to do, but sometimes this deck came together and was a valid archetype because there were some.
Because if you were going to build a skeleton for red-green, just using that example you just used, you're just 100% of the time putting together a werewolf stack, right? Yeah,
I mean, I think I tried to make a werewolf-tinted aggro. And I can assure you that what I built in the skeleton season for the red-green this time would be a very bad deck. I mean, that was clearly missed in terms of how well werewolves would be and how influential they would be. But, it's very tricky because it's a werewolf set. You would expect werewolves to be good. Yes, so you were second guessing yourself all the time.
Yeah. And I mean, so that's where it falls short, right? I mean, you don't get to play the games out, but those type of things just aren't apparent until you do play the games.
No, of course. Yeah. I mean, you can sometimes see that there is something wrong with the archetype. I think that sometimes you see like, okay, it wants me to do this. I just don't see that there is enough cards that will be good in that. Like this season, I definitely was spot on the fact that the Decade zombies are undervalued in terms of their cost. They were almost free. Mm-hmm. And looking at this, my experience with playing tempo decks, I thought, look, they cannot block, but they really sort of can block because if you have 4 of them on the battlefield and it costs you almost nothing, opponent cannot attack you because on the swing back, they're dead.
That's a great point.
So basically, I identified it pretty quickly, and that was a good moment because it's always fun when you identify something before you start playing. But in some cases, it's just impossible to figure it out before the set. And some archetypes are tricky, because you want them to be good.
Yeah.
And this is the eternal problem. If you want something to be good, you're going to invest your heart and not brain into building your skeleton.
That's true.
And that's the moment you miss. I had blue, red spells and Eldraine. I wanted so much to work. Of course it failed. Yeah, of course it failed.
That's tough.
The venture into the dungeon decks, I wanted them to be good. Of course they were bad.
Yes, they were bad. I wanted them to be good too, by the way. So what are the?
So in the end of the format, I think they were slightly better, but in general, they were not as powerful as the black-red.
When you're done with your skeleton, you're doing this with some friends, is that right?
Yes, I'm doing with the Jason IPTG and Sander Kerstens. They are 2 guys that also do some content creation. So we always meet with 3 of us and we discuss our skeletons, disagree here, agree there.
Okay. And what is your kind of hope to come away with? Like, is it just that you feel more comfortable with sort of the shells of what the baseline archetypes look like, and then, you kind of have a better idea where to point your decks?
Yeah, this is my alternative to doing a set preview. So basically, since in the end we're going to build decks, I'd rather focus on building decks rather than evaluating individual cards.
Yeah.
And it also comes to the same thing that started me on analyzing the sub builds of every archetype. I think that cards' win rates are a generic number. And they miss quite a lot when you look at just the pure game and hand win rate. And, this is maybe a good segue to,
yes,
to talk about the win rate.
Let's talk about that.
So, okay. I gave you some examples of the blue-black builds when we talked earlier. And one of the cards that is really poor, as always, enchantment removal is poor, was Locked in the Cemetery. But there are a couple of sub-builds where this card is actually decent. I'm not saying great, but just decent. Like, you want it in your deck actively as a one copy because you can get it later, and it fits what your deck's philosophy is. And especially in those attrition archetypes, because when you have 9 removals, putting this Locked in the Cemetery on something can be actually problematic for them to deal with, because even if they bounce it back, they lose so much tempo and they don't have any other creatures, you can slowly win the game. And when you look at the win rate, and I'm giving like random numbers, if 95% of the blue-black decks are not interested in having Locked in the Cemetery, but 5% are quite interested in having it, of course, you won't see it in the win rate because 95% will completely quench any signal from those 5% smaller decks.
Right.
So if you look at the one number, you just miss it completely, that there are builds where this card is going to be good. And I'm sure that there are way better examples of cards that are like this. Locked in the Cemetery is not a particular priority anywhere, but there will be some builds where the cards vary from being almost a bomb to being almost rubbish. And if a card has 65% win rate in the small build and 50% win rate in most of the other builds, the average of it will become like something like 52%, which still tells you it's not a good card. So if you identify this place where it has 65% win rate, and you can do it stringently with some types of analyses, something that other people might not know just by looking at the sheer number. And I think that we can go back to Paulo Vitor's draft. So when I tell that I would be quite interested in picking the Seize the Storm, the reason for that is that in those super high level drafts, people are very good and very well informed. They invested time in learning the format, which means that they consumed a bunch of content. They played a lot. They consulted with really good limited brains, which will result in them having very similar pick orders in terms of which cards are strong. If you pick Seize the Storm, your priorities and pick orders change completely. You're drafting in a different way than the rest of the table. And because you're drafting differently than the rest of the table, because your priorities are slightly shifted, you can get cards that are good for you quite late.
Yes.
Because no one else is interested in them, because for them they are not good.
Right.
And this sort of turns the draft a bit upside down. And obviously it's a risky strategy in the World Championship. But I do like to do that kind of thing in normal drafts, because if I'm on a different pick order than the rest of the field that I'm drafting with, I can guarantee myself late picks that are actually productive for my decks because no one else is interested in them.
Yeah, so that's so great. It's a bigger picture version of something that we try to pitch on the show, to our listeners, which is about, it's not about just figuring out what the most powerful card is. It's about the delta between what other people think it is to how you can actually use the card, right? I mean, the best deck, if blue-black, let's just say in this format, if blue-black is just the best deck, let's just assume it is, and everybody's kind of scrapping it out for those, but you knew, that white-red was actually really, really good if you were the only one in it or whatever, you would have a huge advantage knowing that, right? And that's like each individual card can express that advantage over and over and over again if you're the only one doing it. And, this doesn't happen really anymore because the data travels so quickly. But, there was a time when it would take a week or two for the format to kind of adjust to what people were doing, like when it was just on Magic Online before Arena and or at the local store. And at the local store, I'm assuming it's still like this. I haven't drafted at one in a couple of years, but I'm assuming that it also adapts relatively slowly. Where, man, if you can find an archetype that's underdrafted and has cards that look like crap that nobody else wants, and that it actually is a thing, it feels broken, right? I mean, you just feel like you have a superpower when you sit down to draft, because you're getting cards that you open a card that you know is really important for your deck and you feel like 90% confident it will just wheel. It's like, there's no better feeling than that, when you're just like, nobody else wants this, but I know it's good. And that's kind of reflective of what you're saying.
Well, guess what I drafted in my last F&M in my LGS.
I would hope that you opened a Seize the Storm at some point and took it.
It got passed to me, and I went I went full Jund, like quite heavy on the black. But I got like 5 black removals, a bunch of red spells, and some Shadow Beast sightings, and Seize the Storms. Boy, it played well. It played well.
That's incredible. Yeah, right where you want to be in this world, draft, getting past the Storms, playing 3 colors.
I mean, mana was a bit shaky, but I put a couple of jack-o'-lanterns and it was all fine.
Yeah. That actually reminds me another thing I wanted to talk about that's along the same veins of what we've been talking about here, which is as we move forward, right, we want to make sure that we're at the forefront of how this data stuff works, right? Like, we've prioritized having you come on the show to help us understand it and to tell us kind of the latest and greatest, but it is constantly evolving, right? And like the thing that you just said about, hey, if you just look at the games in hand win rate, you're selling yourself short if you don't contextualize the card in the type of deck that you're drafting, right? Like, that's something really useful that people can go, oh, so you're telling me that Festival Crasher doesn't have a super high win rate, right? Because red-green doesn't really care about it, or, whatever. The Vampires deck doesn't want it, or whatever. But if I am a heavy spells-based deck, it might be the best card to have, right? Like, that's one of those situations where, there's a huge gap in how important it is for your deck versus it's basically filler, in most other decks that don't care about spells particularly. Right. And if you can do that, well, you're getting an edge, even over people that are aware of 17 lands, everybody who's aware of 17 lands automatically has an advantage over the people that don't. Everybody who listens to this podcast has an advantage over the people who don't. Like, we're already like climbing up the limited ladder here of, what is the information that you have available to you? Do you care enough to look it up, to listen to us talk about it, to read the website, that type of stuff? You're already kind of leaving people behind, but each of these lets you use this stuff better and better. And one trend that I've seen happen as people are clearly hungry for this stuff are people like Ryan Sachs, 2 Duck Cubed, Max Mick, doing kind of Twitter threads or deep dives on videos or whatever about the data. They're taking your data from 17 lands and they're really doing like what you do, right? Where like, oh, I have a question. Let's see if this data can help answer it. Here's how I'm going to go about that. And you have a background in science, so you kind of have the tools and the mentality to do it. And frankly, some of these guys do too. A lot of them are data analysts or, whatever. And so they'll say, here's a chart, here's a plot, here's whatever, and they'll go through it. But it really does, to me, shine a light on the fact that this data really needs to be interpreted to be used to the fullest. What do you think about that?
So first of all, I mean, of all the people that you mentioned, all of them have a very strong data background. Mm-hmm. And also, I mean, I have to admit with pain, both 2 Duck Cubed, who I collaborate quite a lot with, and we feed ourselves some data ideas and we brainstorm on occasions. Way better player than I am in terms of gameplay.
Okay, so, fair enough.
If analyzing data would be such a big boost, I would have been Mythic 1 all the time. I'm not. And there's another additional reason for that. You have to combine it with playing well. I know my limitations there. Ryan Sachs is phenomenal, and I would blindly recommend. Also, Jason, who is recording the Skeletons with me, he's also doing some things on 17 Lens data, but he's focusing on exactly what we were talking, cards that are undervalued by the community in general.
What's his Twitter, or how do we?
I have to.
Yeah, we need to make sure. If you're going to give him a shout out, we got to make sure people can find him. Is it Jason ILTG?
Jason ILTG on Twitter, yeah.
Okay, that's great. And so I didn't mean to interrupt you though. You were saying that he was doing some what do you call it? Data interpretation, data.
Yeah, looking for cards that are undervalued. So basically cards that he considers very strong and find a spot in the build and explains what is the spot in the build, what role does this card fulfill, and then only focuses on cards that are wheeling regularly, so you can actually plan around having them in your deck. Like, good example would be Blessed Defiance, which has a very high win rate, but is still very undervalued. And even you could see that on the Worlds, that people are not keen on picking that card up.
Yeah.
Well, this card, like, I had obscene turns with Blessed Defiance in white-green decks, when you just attack with something, they block, and you know it's going to be lethal. You play this, and then you play the fight spell on the same creature that already has lifelink to kill something smaller. You gain like 12 life.
Yeah.
gain 12 life, get a 1/1 flyer out of it, and they lose 2 creatures for the cost of 2-3 cards, basically, which is a good deal, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. And so, you know, to me, this really does, though, shine that focus on how we interpret the data is like it's as important as having access to it, right? And this is something that you and I have talked about on the show before, but it really does seem, well, it's difficult, right? Because a lot of the stuff that like you're doing, and Two Duct and Ryan and Jason and Max they take some time, they take some effort. These are not obvious concepts, right? These are things that they're going, look, I think I may have found something, but the thread that I see in all of these is context, right? Like, that to me is the kind of the biggest challenge that we face as people who want to get a bunch of data out of this, is what is the best way for us to contextualize it? And I think that you've given some examples of that just in this very episode, where within a given archetype, a card can have a much higher win rate. It can go from unplayable to playable, right? It can go from barely playable to a card you want. It can even go from unplayable to a good card, right? Like there's all these different changes that can happen. And of course it happens in reverse as well, where, you know, there's a card that generally is accepted as pretty good, or a card that you want, but in a certain archetype, it just falls away because other things get prioritized over it, or it doesn't synergize well with it, or whatever. And that to me is kind of the next step forward, is to understand that generalizations, you know, as a podcast, we've tried to go away from them. Like, you know, when we first started doing LR, the thing that people did is they would just make a ranked list of cards. That was it.
Pick order.
Pick orders, right? And we were like, don't use pick orders. Like they're fine. Pack one, pick one. Like, sure, you know, take the highest thing. But even then you're giving up something, because you may have personal preferences. There may be color preferences where one card does well, but it's hard to make it work in the format or whatever. So you may be giving up some openness by taking it. So even then it doesn't work well. And then of course, once you're, you know, 5 picks deep, pick orders just fall apart usually. And so,
definitely.
Yeah. So, you know, we do the set reviews as a way to, let people know that don't have the time to sit here and go over every single card themselves and really sit there and go, what conditions would this card be good? You know, it's like, we're just going to give that to you so you have it. But really then the work begins, right? Because now we're drafting and we start to see archetypes. How do you see us moving forward, where this contextualization becomes more part of how we talk about cards and how we view the data?
So I think that, you know, I really enjoy listening to especially pre-release set reviews. Mm-hmm. I think that one thing that is missing is return to the pre-release set reviews after the set's been with you for a while, and coming back and maybe pointing at hits and misses and speculation on why has it been good. The other thing that I will definitely slowly work into my seminars is across set comparisons, because you will have cards like Ill-Gotten Inheritance that was good in Ravnica Allegiance. Then a couple of sets later, you had a card with a similar effect that was absolute last pick material.
Yep.
And then comparing what conditions in those two sets made those cards so completely different, and why this one was a bomb and this one is unplayable. I know that one card has an additional ability, which is quite important, but that's not everything. And you look at the set mechanics, this one synergized with them, this one didn't synergize with anything. And, you know, like trying to figure out what conditions make a card a surprise bomb. Especially I would like to focus on cards that were underappreciated initially. Because if they were underappreciated, it means that there was something that was not caught by the current fundamentals in those cards.
Yes.
Like for the last several sets, we see this repetitive pattern of creatures with accidental life gain becoming really strong.
Yeah.
I'm talking about you, Vampire Spawn from AFR.
Yeah.
I'm talking about you, Lunark Veteran from Midnight Hunt.
Yes.
These cards have spectacular win rates, and they all have incidental life gain, and that's something that was maybe missed. Because I don't think that anyone would have thought that Lunark Veteran is going to be a top win rate common in the set.
Right.
And, after a couple of, 4 weeks of the set being here, we should slowly start admitting, yes, this is probably the best white common.
Right.
And in some archetypes more than in the others, but in the archetypes when it's good, it's oppressive, really. You see that card on turn 1 and you go like...
Yeah. Am I going to have to use a removal spell on both halves of that? Like, it's really good. Yeah.
I think part of the secret why Neonate Rush is actually decent.
Because it kills it?
You can kill half and you still don't lose a card.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, so just trying to figure out, like, fundamentals are going to shift because the set design is shifting as well. So
yeah,
trying to look at what common truths, like, obvious common truth from 5 years ago, 1-drops are bad. They were bad. I mean, I don't think that you guys missed anything on that. They started being good because they changed how they design sets.
Yeah.
And what changed exactly, and why do the 1-drops are all of a sudden good? Is it because they designed them differently, or is it because the rest of the set is designed in a way that 1-drops are all of a sudden good because you have, better cards, shorter games, best of one smoothing and stuff like that?
Totally. Yeah. We follow those trends. We follow the ones with removal as well as it. There was a long time where they decided to make removal slower, right? They basically just said, basically Doomblade went from common to uncommon to we're not doing that anymore. But, they've, since it kind of, comes and goes as different designers and design philosophies kind of come in and out of the building down at Wizards. And, that's another thing that we've always kept our eye on. And then there's, a lot of intuition. I don't know what, we've drafted a whole lot. So we're kind of like, well, generally speaking, these type of cards don't perform well. There have always been exceptions. There always will be. But if we're looking for a starting point, this group of cards, say, auras that make creatures better, but cost 4 mana or whatever, right? Like those are dangerous, high risk, usually not worth it type cards, right? A lot of times your creature gets killed out from under it at some point, and you're, hugely behind as a result, right? So we'll usually start off with those. Of course, there have been times where it's like, no, you kind of want to make a Voltron. Like you can, the format doesn't actually lend itself to having your creature killed that often from underneath it, and you can kill them before they can. And, all of those type of exceptions. Make it really interesting.
I see, for example, like 2/1s are sometimes amazing, awesome. They're just what you want. And sometimes, it's a 2/1. It's unplayable.
It's trash.
The one that disqualifies it.
Yeah.
And because I don't want to sound like I'm offensive and aggressive towards set reviews, because I do love them and I listen to every single one of them in multiples and sometimes a couple of times. Because for me, it's like the debutante ball for the new set. It's just like you introduce the cards. I don't always, focus on the grades. I know that some people do, but I think that like what you and Mark and LSV do, that is super important. You give context to the card and you use on the previous experiences, and you give a rationale for the grade, which is way more important than the letter, because, I always get frustrated though. Oh, it's something between C+ and B-. There is a big difference between C+ and B-. That's two different categories. You cannot say that it's either or. But anyway, these are just the numbers. But the context is super relevant, because based on the context, you can build your stuff. And as I said, there are individual cards when set reviews go wrong. It's not that it's 80% of the cards. It's 5 cards per set. We're talking about hundreds of cards, which means that the fundamentals are generally very good. It just would be nice to pinpoint why sometimes they're wrong. Yeah. Because it might be the beginning of a paradigm shift, or it might be just a one-off error because of some particular intricacies of the set. In both cases, I think that using very careful analysis, you can figure that out retrospectively, but that will prepare you for the next time.
I love that. Yeah. And that's definitely one of our missions, right? Is like we try to say, well, that didn't, end up how we thought, right? I think the card that I'll think about the most, there's groups of cards here, because I think that this set particularly was probably one of the ones that there would be the most changes from how I'd grade a card now to how we did in the set review. This set really threw us a lot of curveballs. Basically all of the red and green werewolves are probably down like half a grade or something from what we gave them just across the board, which is weird. A thing usually doesn't quite miss that hard, but it did here. I always think of Ecstatic Awakener, though. It was a particularly difficult card to grade, and I didn't really feel super confident about it one way or the other. But when I saw it, I thought maybe the sacrifice deck, they want this extra thing. And it's like, I think we just missed on it in the sense that, like, if I just read it, I'm like, this is kind of difficult to interact with. Like, you're getting the card either way. And, the body that it makes is really good. It also, like, kind of messes with combat and blocking. It lets you leave up mana. Like, it has all these, like, extra benefits, and it's not actually costing you anything, right? Like,
and you get the zombies back for free.
And then the zombies for free, which we were aware of that there was going to be those. We did not know that they would be free, right? I mean, that to me is kind of the I don't know. I having never designed a set, I don't want to say, oh, this was a mistake or that was a mistake, but I do feel like when they shipped the set out the door at Wizards that they probably, like, they tacked zombies onto almost every playable type of card in blue and some in black, where it's just like, why does this need a zombie? Like, they must have really thought they were just like attack once and that was it. Or maybe if you're black, white, they're good sacrifice fodder. But it turns out we had like a lot more uses for them than that. They're actually worth quite a bit.
If you're talking about unnecessary attachments, Diregraph Horde, and why does it have to exile my Seize the Storm from the graveyard? Why?
I think that they just missed on that one. Or maybe, sometimes what we hear about like a couple of years later, right, is they'll say, well, that was actually an uncommon and we bumped it down and then didn't take off enough, basically. Like, those things happen all the time where, the thing gets rarity shifted or whatever.
All the complaining aside, I think we're living in the golden age of limited.
Oh, yeah.
I drafted Stronghold, yeah.
Yeah, totally. It is funny because we of course, as part of this show is we need to talk about the things that we see wrong or that didn't work, but we try to really make sure that the grade that we give at the end of the Sunset shows are reflective of what we really feel about the set as a whole, because it is just so easy to take, like, we could have a whole conversation about decay zombies and how they shouldn't have been tacked onto everything and that Wizards maybe undervalued them. We could talk about it for half an hour. But you could say, well, what do you think of the set? And you would think I hated it because of this. And I would be like, oh, it's an easy A. Like, this is one of the best sets they've had in a long time. I will not stop drafting it until the next thing comes out. I'm kind of bummed that Crimson Vow's coming out so soon, because normally we'd have like months more of this. And I feel like I have a lot more. I probably draft this set 150 times or something, but I'm ready for another 100. Like, this set's been awesome. And I always try to do that to make sure
I have to say that first week I was a bit weary because I knew that the blue-black is not as strong as red-black was in the AFR. Mm-hmm. I mean, the numbers were just not there. And you could see that other archetypes are also good. They're just underdrafted, and blue-black is just the easiest thing to do. But I was afraid of that kind of dominance of one archetype that just makes it
Me too.
boring. And like my first trophies were blue-black because it was just the easiest thing to draft because it was so open.
Yeah.
But And that's a great thing that content creators can do. I think that a large part to content creators pointing to the blue-black as, look, it's too open. Start drafting it. Go into it. People went into it, and it really was the self-regulatory kind of nature of draft in action. And then the whole set became like completely open for me because I could draft any single archetype, and I know that I can trophy with any color combination, which doesn't happen very often. So. Yeah. Maybe it's not an old-timer because there are some minor issues with it, but it's definitely a great set, and I really have pleasure on trying to find those like niche builds and there's so much synergy in there that you can actually build interesting builds. I was so happy yesterday that I finally got to play with a deck that could utilize well the Ominous Roost, and the card was busted. I played the silly card that doesn't play very well, the 2/4 that you put counters on it when something dies. and I was blocking on the floor and attacking with the increasingly growing birds.
Oh, that's pretty cool. Very nice. All right. Well, I think this is a good place for us to call it a show here, Sierkovitz. First off, I want to say thank you so much again for coming on and guest co-hosting with me while Luis is away. I really appreciate it, that you took the time to do so, because you're over in Europe and I know it's quite a bit later for you and you've got a lot of stuff going on. So thank you for coming on.
Oh, thank you. I would never say no to limited resources. Come on. Especially when you can be a co-host.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. This goes on your resume,
Yeah, no. I can update my Twitter handle now.
Yeah, co-host Limited Resources Podcast. Yeah,
co-host of Limited Resources.
Yeah, once. But anyway, I appreciate it. I know Luis does as well, given that he's out taking care of the kid and making the adjustments. Where can people find you? We talked about your Twitch and your YouTube. I'm going to put links to those in the show notes. What about Twitter or anything else that you want to let people know about 17 Lands, etc.?
Everywhere I am, it's Sierkovitz. So Twitter is the same. And I'm mainly operating on Twitter. I do occasionally put things on YouTube and slowly will build that portfolio of my magic numbers stream. And every week I try to stream one data stream called Magic Numbers on my Twitch. So be no stranger, come in and then you can chat directly, look at the process that's going on and maybe go for They seem to groan like outrageously long, some of those seminars. There's like 2.5 hours of talking about Seize the Storm was maybe for connoisseurs only, but I try to also touch on the general topics. And good point of the stream, you can always stop watching if you're tired of something. I can't stop talking, so that's my problem.
That's great.
But I think that, the point of talking about data, it becomes very difficult to go a bit more deeper into the topic without visual aids. That's why I chose stream as the form of communication, because I like to show the graphs so you can draw your attention to the numbers without repeating 50 percentage point in a row in an audio, which can be tiresome, I know.
Of course. What about for 17 Lands?
Well, for 17 Lands, you have to go to 17lands.com, but I assume that most limited resource listeners already did that long time ago. Mm-hmm. However, you can also support them, and I would highly encourage it. So I don't care about monetization. I don't get any financial support from 17 Lands. I do it because I do believe in them a lot. I think that they're doing amazing job. I know how hard they work because I see it from the inside. So if you have a spare $5 and you can afford it, you can go on their Patreon and support 17 Lands. I think it's very important because this service is provided for free, but data storage, data transfers, they do cost money. And I do know that the founder of 17 Lands on occasions had a tough month when there was no Patreon money incoming. I think now it's all right. But he had to actually pay from his own money for delivering you the service that everyone enjoys. So I think it was a bit unfair. So if you can, please do support.
Yeah, and I'm a 17 Lands Patreon supporter and definitely encourage you to do so as well. It's a really cool service and it makes the thing that we all love even more interesting. It makes limited magic for us even more interesting, something that we can go even more in depth on. And as we always try to, do on this show as well, it's, when you get good at interpreting stuff like this, you can apply it to other things in your life. It's not just this one skill set that's just sort of useless once you, let's say you're like, oh, I'm not going to play Magic anymore. It doesn't just go away. The mentality that you take about taking data, how your brain interprets it, what's actually useful, actionable versus kind of interesting versus actually misleading. You need to be able to do this. And of course, as we move forward, we already are in an information-based society, but it is going further in that direction, not away from it. So these are all skill sets that are become more and more useful as time goes on. Okay, Sierkovitz, I'm going to let you go. Thanks again for coming on. If you want to find us on social media, I'm Marshall_LR. And you can find everything related to the podcast at lrcast.com. I want to remind you about our sponsors, Channel Fireball. Make sure you check them out. If you need any singles or anything with the new marketplace, and use the affiliate code LR at checkout. And if you are interested in picking up some digital assets like cryptocurrency or NFTs, you can go to ftx.us inside the US and ftx.com outside. I'll remind you once again I'm not a financial advisor. Make sure you educate yourself and consult one before you do investing of any kind. That's going to do it for this episode. We'll see you next week.